creating cultural awareness and understanding. This is Culture Clique. Culture Clique is written and produced by KQAL FM on the campus of Winona State University.
Raise your glasses and put on your glasses, because today on Culture Clique, we're bringing you a Part 2 continuation of the 3-part series of the 38th Nerd Nite hosted at the No Name Bar. Nerd Nite is a monthly event hosted for nerds, by nerds, with drinks. This event was put on by WSU professors Dr. Carl Ferkinhoff and Dr. Emily Ruff, where 3 candidates get 15 to 30 minutes to nerd out and speak about their passions. So, if you have a topic you're passionate about or knowledgeable enough to be called a nerd, this event is the place to be. I'm Dylan Alzate, and crack open your textbooks as we nerd it out at Nerd Nite today on Culture Clique.
All right, nerds, it's time for our second talk. Oh, we got something to drink. You're settled in. We got a fun one here from Dan Wilson. Dan Wilson currently works with 2 nonpartisan groups, Minnesota Voice and Engage Winona, on projects designed to increase voter turnout regardless of party or candidate preference. We're excited to have him here again. This is his second speech. So here's Dan Wilson.
I'm just pleasantly loud. Okay. Now I'm on. Okay. So turns out Winona does a bad job at voter turnout. And I'm going to talk about that tonight, some of the reasons why. But first, just a big disclaimer there at pressing buttons. Second disclaimer, I'm bad at buttons. Yeah, there we go. That'll work. So right now I'm like double employed by 2 different 501c3s, which means very practically, even though I've ran in the past with a party, all the stuff I'm talking about tonight is is political, right? Talks about policy, talks about how policy impacts us, but it's not partisan, right? So nonprofits, by definition, need to be nonpartisan, can't promote a specific party or specific person. I'm doing one project with Engage Winona. I'm doing a different project with Minnesota Voice because democracy is great. It's important. We should go out and do stuff. Okay, so... do something. Okay, looking at the big picture, right? Like, let's look at voter turnout in the United States in 2022. Minnesota was at 61%, which was pretty good for Minnesota. However, Washington, Oregon, all these other red states in this picture did better than Minnesota. You were like 70 or 80% turnout. So it's not that Minnesota's turnout went lower, it's that everybody else's turnout went higher. Abortion was on the ballot in some of those states, very contested governor's races. So, Minnesota being Minnesota, we were not number 1 in 2022, and the Secretary of State's office is very pissed off about it, which is great. Normally, our presidential year turnout is closer to 80%, right? So, but like 61% midterm election is pretty good. Zooming in even more, like let's look at Minnesota, right? 2022, we are actually like the 5th worst in the state for Winona. Average was 61%, Winona's was 50%, and all the other counties below it that had worse turnout were a lot smaller. So that means there was like a smaller amount of people not voting. So the only other county that was kind of like a similar size county to ours was Polk County in the Northwest, and that was only 2 or 3 percentage points worse. Right, so in the context of Minnesota, Winona has pretty bad turnout. And it's not just the midterm. 2020, right? It's kind of the similar position, 5th worst, 2nd in terms of population. 2018, 2016, kind of like still in the same universe of like very much bottom of the list. 2014, the actual bottom of the list, right? So I like to talk about this because this is not how Winona perceives itself, right? We like to think of ourselves, we're very motivated, we're an activated community, we're doing lots of great stuff. If you just like sit down and look at the numbers, Winona is pretty unexceptional and maybe exceptionally bad in terms of our turnout. So what is that specifically, right? Like, let's look at Winona County. So deep purple would be 80%. So most of the county, right, we see kind of average is this dark pink. A light pink is kind of a little bit below average. And then yellow is, right, way below 40%. So looking at the map, it's not Winona County, it's Winona City. That is a problem. Let's take a look at Winona City. And it's not Winona City, it's downtown, which is the problem, right? Like, most of the city itself is kind of average-ish. 60% would be average for the state. So they're a little. So the city itself is a little bit below, but like kind of that core, right? So kind of the question when you think about like why is this? I had this perception that Winona was great. It's not great. What's going on? Kind of ask yourself, who are these people? Who's living in these precincts? Like, what's going on? What is unique to those areas of Winona? And like, good to point out, these areas of Winona, right? It says below 40%. I looked at the map before coming over, 30%, right? So the vast majority of people living in this part of town do not vote, right? If only 30% of people are voting, 70% of people living there are not voting. So if you live in this area and you voted, you're in the minority. So right, who are these people? Let's dig into some of the demographic data that we have about this. Kind of not surprisingly, right? This is true throughout the United States, right? If you identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC, that tends to nationally, that drops your likelihood to vote by about 12%, right? So that's a mitigating factor. Also, right, this is a nice graph looking at age. Age is a big thing that makes you less likely to vote. 18 to 24 years old takes off like another 30% of your likelihood to vote, right? So if you are BIPOC, if you are 18 to 24 years old, those are knocks against you. And surprisingly or not surprisingly, if you do not own a home, if you are a renter, that is a huge factor in whether or not you vote. So looking at survey data, 33% of eligible renters voted, right? So like if you're a renter, that again drops your likelihood to vote by a huge margin. So I have been like poring over spreadsheets and looking at precinct level data and looking at precinct level demographics for like over a year, just kind of like really digging into it. And I've given a couple presentations about this. And so recently the U of M, like just really recently, a couple weeks ago, they put out a map kind of looking at the precinct, looking at demographics precinct level wide, looking at turnout precinct level wide. And I was able to kind of put this all in a really great map format. I've been giving this presentation just getting people to look at spreadsheets, looking at color-coded spreadsheets, which is not fun and not entertaining. So thank you, U of M, for providing this great resource that makes this talk a lot more interesting. But here's my pitch for color-coded spreadsheets. They're the best. You can kind of see some correlation here. If you look at the colors, they are both light at the top, right? You can see percentage of BIPOC is darker, percentage of renters darker, turnout is lower. I don't know. I love color-coded spreadsheets. They're not great. This is much more useful, right? So this is looking at a percentage of BIPOC in a precinct overlapped with the percentage of turnout in a precinct. And like it's important to note statistics-wise, these are correlations, right? The data is not asking each person of color if they voted. They're just kind of laying over these two things that we know over the same precinct, right? So this graph shows us dark yellow is high BIPOC, low turnout. Light blue would be high turnout, low BIPOC. So like high turnout, really white. Low turnout, really BIPOC. So looking at the county, right, there's a lot of light blue, right? A lot of like actually pretty good turnout, but not a lot of diversity. And again, kind of like zooming in on the city, we kind of see a similar map to what we saw earlier, right? The kind of the core of the city, right, is low turnout, right, but a higher percentage of BIPOC individuals. So kind of getting a sense of who these people are living in these precincts. It's also good to note that the census makes up their own census blocks for collecting their information. So census data and precinct data does not talk well with each other, which is very stupid. I don't know why they do that. Anyways, so right, this is our census data from this part of town, this part of Winona. This area, Winona itself, right, is 30% turnout, incredibly low. But people who live here are 80% of them are renters. 79.1% of them are renters. And 67% of the people that live in this part of town are between the ages of 18 and 24. Right? So you kind of have all these big factors, your age, whether or not you're identified as a person of color, whether or not you rent, kind of all those factors really kind of come together into this area of town, which just drive turnout fairly low. And specifically these, 4 or 5 precincts, which drops the whole county of Winona down for voter turnout. Why does this matter, right? Other than wanting to view ourselves as a good civic city, why does voter turnout even matter? And so my argument is it's important, and it's important regardless of party, regardless of candidate. It's intrinsically important, right? If a higher percentage of people are voting, that is more likely that more people are running for office. If there is more competition in politics, politicians will feel more inclined to do a better job because they'll be more afraid of being voted out, right? So competition generally in politics makes our politics run better. But the other interesting thing is this Health and Democracy Index, right? So there's this group kind of took a look at public health, ranked 15 or 20 scores on public health, and then looked at democracy, so how easy it is to vote, kind of participation in elections, ranked those, and then kind of put all 50 states on a scatter map, and looked at, does this state have a healthy democracy, and how is their public health, right? So we see Minnesota, pretty decent voter access, and good health, and then right here we see Tennessee, harder, less voting access, worse health, and there's for a scatter plot like this, New Hampshire, who knows what the fuck is going on in New Hampshire? I don't know. That's weird. But there's a strong correlation there. New Hampshire is an outlier. So is Louisiana. Louisiana just has terrible health. Sucks to live there. Awesome to live in Minnesota. Right? So intrinsically, these public health, democracy, those are really big, complicated data sets, right? There's a lot of noise in that data. It's hard to tell, but we can see, generally speaking, if more people vote, right, those communities tend to be healthier, right? So regardless of your political persuasion, regardless of who you think should get elected, just intrinsically, the more people that vote, the better it is for that community. So okay, we want Winona to be healthy. We want Winona to be a good community. What do we do about it? How do we increase voter turnout? Like I said, if you're the Secretary of State, you be very explicit about game on, motherfuckers, we're doing it. We're gonna get number 1 again. Thank you, Colorado, which is great. They're gonna spend a bunch of money. They're gonna be out there. They're gonna be talking about get out to vote. They're going to do the whole publicity campaign, which is great. I love this message of Minnesota wants to be number 1 in this, which is kind of weird, but it's awesome. So that's one of the things that I'm doing, and with Engage Winona, leadership is for everyone, right? We are having a series of block parties around town with kind of the theory of change that voting is a great thing to do, but it's also just the first step on your pathway to leadership. And so, yes, register to vote with the League of Women Voters, but also here are all these other great nonprofits in town that are doing great stuff. So register to vote and then get involved in other ways. I just spent the afternoon hanging these door hangers. So if you live next to the East End Rec, you probably saw one of these on your door. And if you, like myself, read the American Political Science Review, you probably remember this banger from September of 2000, right? That was an exciting article that we all have read. Basically, right, a good article. Basically, canvassing is the best. Everything else doesn't really work that well. Going back to the 50s, right? You got 40% effect on turnout, 20%, 14 to 20% in the 2000s and 1998, right? So these, the Secretary of State, other groups are going to be sending you a bunch of stuff, mails, you get phone calls, things like that. They all don't work as well as just someone showing up to your door and having an awkward conversation with you because you don't want to be talking to them, right? That's a really memorable experience. And because it's such a weird experience, it motivates people to do something, right? So just in terms of effectiveness, it really works, which is what I'm doing with Minnesota Voice, a completely separate nonprofit. We'll be going around. I'm working with a team of canvassers in Winona to go to people's doors, to specifically target these neighborhoods, show up, register them to vote, explain how you vote the same day of election. This door hanger is wrong. The election's not on November 4th. It's on November 5th. So that was a good thing to catch before it went to the printer. It would have been illegal. And then for everyone in this room, right? all you nerds out here, please talk to your neighbors. Like, I know that's a hard pitch, but like, especially if you live in those neighborhoods, like in the core of the city, right? If you live in those neighborhoods, if you voted, you're the minority, right? Like, more than likely, your neighbors around you aren't voting. So it's just very simply, right, if you want to help change that dynamic, and like, it's good to point out in a city like Winona, the degrees of separation, right, like, are pretty small. Like, if you talk to 5 or 6 people, that actually makes a pretty big difference. So like, you can drive people to the polls. Minnesota has really great election laws. You can vouch for somebody on election day. Like, if you take your neighbor to the polls and say, this person lives in my precinct, the election judge says, okay, and then they can vote. It's pretty great. You can do that for 8 people. So literally, if you like go to your neighbor's house, pick up 8 people, drive them to the polls, they all vote. If you work in a nursing home or a dorm, you can vouch for anyone that lives in that nursing home. Go to minnesotavotes.gov. That also talks about all this stuff. And employees can take paid time off, right? So like, Minnesota allows same-day voter registration. That's super helpful. That's really what makes our voting turnout so great. And then general, if you talk to people about voting, don't use this language, right? Like, don't talk about voter turnout sucking. I talk about it with this group of people because like, I assume that you all don't believe this. But right, like, in general, when we talk with people about voting, about civic engagement, right, asset-based, identity-based messaging, right, the voter is a hero and voting is very effective. That tends to be the type of language we want to use, right? A couple of years ago, there was a primary for a county commissioner race that was tied, right? So like, very, very practically, voting is, one vote would have made the difference. That race was tied, and then they drew a card to figure out who the winner would be, and they both drew aces. So I had to draw again, which is wild, right? So like, those are just like good ways to talk with people about voting, what that looks like practically. This is from We Make Our Future, right? Kind of this like very aspirational, make the future, be a voter, this kind of like identifying yourself as a voter, and that identity creating positive change is the way to talk about it generally. So yeah, let's make our future, be voters. That's the end of my talk. And I would love to take questions. Okay, well, you got it. Great.
Yeah.
So in the middle of town, where there are renters, there are different types of rentals. You have some of the big complexes. Does canvassing in those areas make it difficult because of security reasons of getting into those buildings? And there's also going to be a high number of student rentals, so maybe more transient. So are those things taken into consideration? I mean, how do you get into some of those buildings to canvass too?
So in Minnesota, if you are a candidate running for office, apartments are required to let you into that building by law. If you're just some schmuck walking around trying to get people to vote, they don't have to let you in. So generally the strategy is to piggyback, kind of like sneak your way into the apartment building. Or, so there's a couple big ones downtown. So if we find that our canvassers are getting locked out of those, you'll be talking with somebody else that's on the ballot and kind of like timing those at the same time is how you do it. And with student rentals, yeah, it's a super transient population. So with those groups, right, it's with targeting students, it's going to be talking with people at their doors, but it's also going to be giving them a lot of specific information a couple weeks before the election, right? Like just going door to door, putting a door hanger on everyone's door saying, this is where your voting location is. This is how you register the same day. So just having more targeted messaging for those folks. Yeah.
I live in that neighborhood where the voting turnout is the suckiest.
Yes.
Yeah, and so I don't understand why you're going to have that block party over there at the East End Rec, because it couldn't be farther away from where I live. My neighbors hardly ever, some of them work, they don't answer their doors, whatever. I don't know whether they vote or not, tell you the honest truth. But a lot of them are students who rent, and I wonder if a student's old enough to vote, if they vote at home as an absentee, or do they vote at school here in Winona? So it might be that they already vote at home when they go home on the weekend, or, well, no, they.
Yes, great question. We hosted a block party at Maplewoods. We're doing a block party at East End Rec Center, and then we're doing a block party downtown at Peters Beer Garden. So kind of all over town. For students, the Secretary of State tells people to vote where they feel like their home is, which is very vague. But like, if the Secretary of State is excited for people to do mail-in ballots, regardless if they like live in Winona, but like they consider New Hope their home, right? But so I think my voting strategy for Winona specifically, like if students are anything like me, who really intended to do a mail-in ballot for the primary a couple of weeks ago, but didn't, we'll be providing that information on how you vote and register same day in person to try to capture those folks who intended to maybe do a mail-in ballot someplace else, but just forgot.
We have a question back here.
Yeah.
Hey, so I guess this is me asking for a little bit of free advice.
Yeah.
So this year, people with felony convictions were able to get their rights to vote back, and I work with a number of people who are kind of processing this and have an extreme level of voter apathy. So do you have any suggestions for individuals with extreme voter apathy? Just a good starting point.
Yeah. Boom. Voting being a hero, right? Like, and voting change, like actually being effective, right? So like, part of the, so like my approach to it in Winona is really a shotgun approach. So this like block party, this approach is like, yeah, voting is lame or whatever, but it's super easy. Like it's gonna be super fast. And if you're really concerned about like drug abuse, then like come to this block party and meet a nonprofit that's doing work about drug abuse, right? Like kind of like viewing voting as the first step on people's journey to like being an active contributor to their community. And then like taking a completely different route is like voting is the way that we change our community, right? Like voting is the only effective way to do it. And I think the numbers, like the surveys show that kind of this messaging tends to be a little bit more powerful with folks that are a little bit apathetic and skeptical of it. I am also with Minnesota Voice, and I'm helping them out in Winona, but doing specific reaching out to to felons. So folks are aware, if you have a felony record, you can vote. Basically, the law now is like as long as you are not currently in jail, you can vote. So this election is the first time that election has changed. The Secretary of State is spending money to like go to door to door, because usually when states make that law change but then don't do anything about it, there actually tends to be not that much of effect in turnout. So yeah.
I've got another one here.
So, two things. One, looking at your statistics, the last time, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the last time I looked at the census, the population non-white in Winona was like 2 or 5%. So how does that work with your numbers there?
Per county, right? So BIPOC in these precincts, I think, is like 18 to 20%. And the county-wide average would be lowered by these very white outside areas.
Okay. And then my second question is, how do you juxtapose your numbers against Winona State? This has been recognized for I don't know how many elections as winning the ballot bowl of having the most college students in comparison to all the other universities in the state as having the most students vote. Yeah.
Grading on a curve. I really is it. Like, right, like these precincts, right, surrounding Winona State are 30% turnout. It's not great. For 18 to 24-year-olds in general, that's pretty good, right? And I think Winona State is probably a little bit above 30 when you break it out, but like, it's a problem. Like, the youth tend to not vote. And so I think but other colleges, like Gustavus in Northfield, whatever that college is called.
St. Peter.
Yes, one of those. One of those colleges has 80% turnout, has 90% turnout. So I look at these numbers and I look at these big national trends of these are trends, these are things. But even in Minnesota, again and again, there's examples of communities going against those trends. And the way that they do it is they spend the time, spend the money to like go out and make voting a like normal thing that is just like assumed that is going to happen. Because if you live in these communities where it's 30% turnout, you're the weirdo if you go and vote, right? Like, and that's kind of the purpose of the block parties as well, is to just normalize this as happening and make people feel more weird for not voting rather than feeling weird for like going out and voting.
We got a couple questions back here.
Questions from the back.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I am definitely one of the people in the room who was surprised by this information, so I appreciate you sharing it. I was interested though when you said so it's correlation, not causation, several times, and I'm nervous, I guess, a little bit that people are going to hear this information and think so it's diverse communities, it's young communities, it's low income communities. And though that's the reason they're not voting. And I'm wondering if there is data and opportunity available to make causation, and we could really focus on like its lack of information around where to vote, its lack of transportation, its lack of time, its lack of accessibility, and like focus on those. And I know you reference that some in your, what do you do and what are your actions? But I'm wondering if there's more opportunity to focus on that part of the message versus the demographic part of the message and where that fits into your empowering voters and empowering people to empower others in their community.
Right. So looking at some of these like broader systemical issues that like cause people to not go out and vote. And so like, yeah, to be clear, this is just the University of Minnesota like does not have data that like talks to each individual BIPOC person in this precinct to see at what percentage they turn out. Right. So like these are all kind of like big factors that like nonprofits like Minnesota Voice use to just like identify where should we spend our resources, right? Like we need to be talking to people. We need to be canvassing people to convince them to vote. Who should we canvass? There are 30,000 people, give or take, in Winona County. Where should we do that, right? So like we can look at voter turnout, and in general, these areas have pretty good turnout, right? Like, and then we know systemically that there are larger things that tend to indicate when people are low turnout, right? So then we can use those factors to help target our canvassing. So with Minnesota Voice, for better or for worse, yeah, St. Charles is over here, right? Yeah, it's a very interesting map. You should all go to this website and check it out. It's super fun. It's a great website. So Minnesota Voice can buy data off the internet. The Secretary of State sells the voter rolls of who votes. So if you're worried about the government getting your information too late, that has happened. If you've ever voted, that ship has sailed. Right, so Minnesota Voice, they buy this information, they figure out who identifies as BIPOC, what ages people are, and they like put all this information in a big database, and then they give it to people like me, who then like tell canvassers to go out and talk to these specific demographics, right? So these demographic factors help us like funnel our resources so that we're talking to the people that are most likely to be hesitant or most likely to like not turn out and vote. I think the like bigger systemic causes that exist, why those folks are less likely to vote, right? Like gets to this point, right? Like let's get everyone out voting. And like it's a big multifactorial thing, but like generally speaking, as states increase their turnout, right? Like we tend to kind of start to address some of these larger factors that lead to voter apathy, that lead to young people not wanting to vote, right? Like that is kind of like some of the tools that we have to like figure out some of these bigger systemic issues.
So we've got time for one more question. Way back in the back.
So just to add to the last questioner's comment about correlation versus causation, you kind of present these categories of BIPOC folks and young folks and economically insecure folks. And those, in my mind, would be categories of people in our communities who get hit on by the political system.
Yes.
And so not actually addressing the fact that they have no incentive to vote because the system continues to f them over is solving for the symptoms and not for the causes. So what incentive can you give them to vote when they have no reason to vote for a system that continues to oppress them?
Yeah. So Minnesota Voice's theory of change around that specifically, right, is if these groups of people that are getting shit on by the system, if they vote as a voting bloc, right, then all of a sudden they amass a huge amount of electoral power, right? And so I'm a farmer. I'm obsessed with farm policy. The reason why farm policy in the United States sucks is because there's no farmers union, right? There is no like collective union of farmers who can all say like, as farmers, we think that these policies are good for us. Whereas, other unions tend to have more political sway because they can ensure that all their members vote in certain ways so that they build electoral power that way. Right, so like talking to these people specifically and saying like, hey, you as a young person, like your vote matters, and specifically with folks 18 to 24-year-olds or the youth vote, right? If all the youth were to vote as a block, they would completely decide elections, right? Like, so encouraging those groups to think about themselves as an electoral group, like, can also build electoral power to then like push back against these larger systemic factors that like tend to shit on folks, right? Like, so if like the youth can view themselves as a electoral group and advocate that they have a future Earth that they could live in, right? Like, if that organizing was to happen, that would be very impactful in our political system. But in order to like get to that point, we have to like make sure that folks are voting first. That kind of like viewing yourself as a voting bloc has like worked in like other different political spaces, and is like one of the reasons I'm excited about this whole like white dude for Harris movement, right? Like viewing white dudes as a political bloc, right, is a thing that has happened, but like, right, like white dudes that we've always given ourselves a pass, like we're not a voting bloc, we're the normal, right? So like I think like starting to identifying groups as voting blocs is the way that you can like use that to kind of push back against these systems that have oppressed people.
All right, let's give Dan another round of applause.
Yeah.
If you have more questions or would like to talk more with Dan, I'm sure he'd be willing to talk with you between talks here. Don't go anywhere. We have one more fabulous talk coming up here in just a few minutes. Grab yourself another drink, and we will hear the amazing, crazy sounds you can make with your voice in just a few minutes.
A huge thanks goes out to the No Name Bar and the Nerd Bosses for making this whole event possible. Tune in next week for a part 3 finale of this nerd-tastic event. To check out Nerd Nite Winona and even sign up as a speaker yourself, visit their Facebook page at Nerd Nite Winona, or find a Nerd Nite near you at nerdnite.com. I'm Dylan Alzate, and for more nerd-tastic or local Winona events, tune into Culture Clique every Thursday at 12:30 right here on 89.5 KQAL. You can also listen to past episodes of Culture Clique on your favorite streaming service. Find links at kqal.org.
Creating cultural awareness and understanding. You've been listening to Culture Clique. Support for Culture Clique is made possible by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Culture Clique is produced by KQAL-FM on the campus of Winona State University. For more information, look us up on the web at kqal.org. And thanks for listening to Culture Clique.